The dust had barely settled on her father's grave when Josephine Crawford realized she was now responsible for keeping her three younger sisters alive in a town that had little mercy for orphans. It was spring of 1882 in Manassa, Colorado, a settlement that existed more as a hopeful promise than an actual town, with wooden buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support and streets that turned to mud rivers whenever the rain decided to visit. Josephine stood there at 19 years old, her hands raw from digging, her heart heavy with grief, and her mind already calculating how many hours she would need to work to afford the next meal. Her sisters huddled behind her, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. Margaret was 15, with the same dark hair as Josephine but a gentler disposition. Caroline had just turned 12, all elbows and knees and questions that Josephine did not have answers for. The youngest, little Anne, was only 8, clutching a worn rag doll that had been their mother's final gift before the fever took her 2 years prior. Their father had done his best after that, working the small farm and taking odd jobs in town, but his heart had given out last week while hauling water from the creek. The preacher said a few final words, his voice competing with the wind that swept down from the mountains. Most of the town had stayed away from the funeral. Disease and death were too common here, and people had learned to protect themselves by not getting too attached. Only Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had come, and she stood at a respectful distance, her face full of pity that Josephine found almost harder to bear than grief. When it was over and they walked back to their small cabin on the edge of town, Josephine took stock of what they had. The farm was barely 2 acres and the soil was stubborn. They had 4 chickens, a goat that gave milk when she felt like it, and a root cellar that was nearly empty. Her father's savings amounted to $3.40, which she found in a tin under his mattress. It was not enough. It would never be enough. That evening, after she had made a thin soup from the last of their vegetables and sent her sisters to bed hungry, Josephine sat at the rough wooden table and made a list by candlelight. She could read and write, thanks to her mother's insistence on education, and she used that skill now to plan their survival. She needed work, and she needed it immediately. The next morning, she woke before dawn and braided her hair tightly, pinning it up in a way that made her look older, more capable. She wore her only good dress, which was already 2 years out of style and patched at the elbows, but it was clean. She told Margaret to watch the younger girls and walked into town as the sun painted the eastern sky orange and pink. Her first stop was the general store. Mr. Patterson looked up from his ledger when she entered, his expression guarded. He was a thin man with spectacles that constantly slid down his nose, and he ran his business with an iron fist and a suspicious heart. "Miss Crawford," he said, his tone neutral. "My condolences about your father." "Thank you, sir," Josephine replied, standing straight despite her exhaustion. "I am here to inquire about work. I can clean, I can stock shelves, and I can manage accounts. My mother taught me figures." Patterson shook his head before she even finished. "I have no positions available. Times are hard for everyone." She had expected this but still felt the rejection like a physical blow. "If anything changes, sir, please remember I asked." "I will," he said, but she could tell he would not. The boarding house was next. Mrs. Henderson was kinder but no more helpful. "Oh, honey, I wish I could. But I do my own cooking and cleaning. This place barely keeps me fed as it is." The saloon made her uncomfortable to even approach, but desperation overrode propriety. She walked in through the back door and found a woman stirring a large pot in the kitchen. Her name was Ruby, and she had hair dyed an improbable shade of red, and a face that had seen too much of life. "You looking for work?" Ruby asked, looking Josephine up and down. You are a pretty thing, but you have that look about you that says you would not last a night upstairs. I need work washing dishes, cleaning floors, anything that needs doing, Josephine said firmly. I have 3 sisters to feed. Ruby studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Come back tonight at 6. I will pay you 50 cents to wash dishes and clean up after we close. It will be late work, and it will be hard, but I will not ask anything else of you. Keep your head down and do not talk to the customers. Thank you, Josephine breathed, feeling the first tiny bit of relief. By the time she returned home, she had secured 2 more positions. The first was with Doc Morrison, who needed someone to change linens, boil instruments, and keep his small clinic clean. The work would be early mornings before patients arrived, and he would pay her 40 cents each time. The second was at the church, where Preacher Davidson needed help washing and mending the linens and cleaning the pews. It paid less, only 20 cents, but it was respectable work that she could do with her sisters if needed. That first week nearly broke her. She woke at 4 in the morning to do the work at the clinic, came home to make breakfast for her sisters and tend the animals, went to the church for afternoon work, returned home for a brief rest, and to make sure the girls had eaten, and then trudged to the saloon for the night shift that often lasted until 2 in the morning. She slept in scattered hours, waking to nightmares of her sisters crying from hunger or being taken away to an orphanage. But they survived. Margaret took over most of the cooking and helped Anne with the simple lessons Josephine insisted they continue. Caroline proved surprisingly good at tending the chickens and goat, and she started a small vegetable garden that she watered faithfully each day. They ate a lot of beans and cornmeal, but they ate. The ache in Josephine's back became a constant companion, and her hands developed calluses on top of calluses, but they made it through each week. It was a Saturday afternoon in late June when everything changed. Josephine was at the church, scrubbing the wooden floors while the preacher was out making visits. Her sisters were with her, helping in their own ways. Anne was dusting the pews with more enthusiasm than skill, while Caroline swept and Margaret polished the brass candlesticks. The door opened, letting in a shaft of golden sunlight and a man Josephine had never seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of honey. He wore dusty traveling clothes and boots that had seen 1,000 miles, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. When he removed his hat, Josephine saw that his eyes were a striking gray-blue, like storm clouds over distant mountains. "Pardon me," he said, his voice deep and courteous. "I am looking for Preacher Davidson. I was told I might find him here." Josephine got to her feet, suddenly aware of her worn dress and the damp rag in her hands. "He is out visiting the sick, sir. He should return within the hour if you would like to wait." The man nodded and took a seat in one of the pews. He did not seem in a hurry, and he watched with interest as the girls went about their work. Anne, never shy, wandered over to him with her duster. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. The man smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him seem younger and more approachable. "I suppose I am, little miss. I have a ranch about 15 miles north of here, just getting it started, really." "We have a goat," Anne announced proudly. "Her name is Buttercup, and she gives milk." "A goat is fine livestock," the man said seriously, as though this was an important business discussion. "I have cattle myself, about 200 head now, though I am hoping to build that up." Margaret had paused in her polishing to listen, and even Caroline had stopped sweeping. They so rarely had anything interesting happen in their days that a stranger was a novelty worth attending to. Josephine cleared her throat. "Anne, come finish your dusting. Let the gentleman wait in peace." "She is not bothering me," the man said. He stood and crossed the space between them, extending his hand. I am Fletcher Irving. I have been meaning to come into town and introduce myself properly, but the work has kept me busy. She wiped her hand on her apron and shook his, trying not to notice how his hand dwarfed hers or how calloused his palm was, marked by hard work just like her own. Josephine Crawford. These are my sisters, Margaret, Caroline, and Anne. A pleasure to meet you all, Fletcher said, nodding to each girl in turn. Crawford, are you Samuel Crawford's daughters? We were, Josephine said quietly. He passed last month. Something shifted in Fletcher's expression, a softening around his eyes. I am sorry for your loss. I met him once last fall. He helped me track down a steer that had wandered off. Would not accept payment, just said that was what neighbors did for each other. Josephine felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away furiously. She could not afford to cry, especially not in front of a stranger. That sounds like our father. An awkward silence fell, broken by the sound of the church door opening again. Preacher Davidson entered, his hat in his hands, his face showing the weariness of a man who had been sitting with the dying. Ah, Fletcher, he said, his expression brightening. I see you found the place. Miss Crawford, thank you for keeping our guest company. Of course, preacher, Josephine said. She turned back to her work, but she could feel Fletcher Irving's eyes on her as the two men moved to the front of the church to talk in low voices. She scrubbed harder, trying to focus on the task at hand and not on the strange fluttering feeling in her chest. The next time she saw Fletcher Irving was 2 weeks later at the general store. She was there to buy flour and salt with the precious coins she had earned, carefully counting out each cent while Mr. Patterson watched with impatience. She was so focused on her transaction that she did not notice Fletcher until he spoke. Add it to my account, Patterson, he said, his voice coming from directly behind her. Josephine spun around, clutching her small package. Sir, I can pay for my own goods. I am sure you can, Fletcher said mildly, but your father did me a kindness once and I would like to return it. Call it paying forward a debt. Pride warred with practicality in Josephine's chest, pride lost as it had to these days. Thank you, Mr. Irving, that is very generous. Just Fletcher, please, he said. He tipped his hat to her and went about his own shopping, loading up enough supplies to fill a wagon. Josephine watched him from the corner of her eye, wondering what it must be like to buy things without having to calculate the cost of every ounce. As she was leaving, Fletcher caught up with her on the dusty street. Miss Crawford, if I might have a word, she stopped, shifting her package to her other arm. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, marks of someone who spent his days squinting into the sun. He was older than her, but not by much. Perhaps 25 or 26. I have been thinking, he said, and there was something almost hesitant in his manner, as though he was unsure how his words would be received. My ranch is growing, and I find I need help. I have heard around town that you are a hard worker, and I wonder if you might be interested in a position. I need someone to handle the house, cook for the ranch hands, and help manage the accounts. It would be full-time work, and I could offer you room and board for you and your sisters, plus wages. Josephine stared at him, certain she had misheard. I am sorry, what? I know it is unusual, Fletcher continued, but I am trying to build something lasting here, and I need reliable people. Your sisters could help with lighter tasks, and they would have steady meals and a roof over their heads. You would have your own cabin on the property, separate from the main house and the bunkhouse. It would be proper. Her mind raced. This could solve everything. Her sisters would be safe, fed, and housed. She would not have to work 3 jobs and sleep only a few hours a night, but it seemed too good, and in her experience, things that seemed too good usually had a catch. Why? She asked bluntly. You do not know us. We could be thieves or worse. Fletcher smiled again, that warm expression that reached his eyes. "Preacher Davidson speaks highly of your character. So does Doc Morrison and even Ruby at the saloon, though she threatened to box my ears if I was less than honorable in my intentions. I trust their judgment. And if I am being honest, Miss Crawford, I could use the help, and you look like you could use a break." "I look that bad?" she asked, attempting humor to cover the sudden swell of emotion. "You look like someone carrying the weight of the world," he said gently. "I am offering to help with the load. That is all. Think about it. I will be in town again next Saturday. You can give me your answer then." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Josephine standing in the street with her flour and salt and the first real hope she had felt in months. That night, after the girls were asleep, Josephine lay awake and thought about Fletcher Irving's offer. She wanted to say yes immediately, but caution held her back. She knew nothing about him beyond what little he had told her. What if he was not honorable? What if this was some scheme? But then she thought about Ruby's words, about Preacher Davidson's trust, and she thought about the way Fletcher had spoken to Anne with genuine kindness rather than annoyance. The next morning, she made inquiries. She asked Doc Morrison, who said Fletcher had paid cash for medical supplies and never complained about the prices. She asked Mrs. Henderson, who had heard from the ranch hands who sometimes came to town that Fletcher was a fair boss who paid on time and did not ask more of his men than he was willing to do himself. Even Ruby, when pressed, admitted that Fletcher came to the saloon only rarely and only for a drink, never causing trouble and always respectful. By Saturday, Josephine had made her decision. When Fletcher rode into town on a handsome bay horse, she was waiting outside the general store with her sisters. She had dressed them all in their best clothes, which was not saying much, but they were clean and neat. "Mr. Irving," she said as he dismounted, "we would like to accept your offer." The smile that crossed his face was genuine and delighted. "That is wonderful news. Can you be ready to move by next weekend? I will send a wagon for your belongings." "We do not have much," Josephine admitted. "We can be ready." "Then it is settled," Fletcher said. He shook her hand formally, as though sealing a business deal, and Josephine felt the course of her life shift like a river changing direction. The week passed in a blur of activity. Josephine gave notice at her 3 jobs, though Ruby insisted she take an extra $1 as a parting gift. They packed up the cabin, which was a depressing exercise that showed just how little they owned. Their clothes fit into 2 bags, their kitchen goods into a single crate, and their personal possessions into a small trunk that had been their mother's. They sold the goat to a neighbor for 75 cents and gave the chickens to the church. On Friday evening, Josephine walked through the empty cabin one last time, remembering her parents and the life they had tried to build here. Then she closed the door and did not look back. Fletcher arrived early Saturday morning with a sturdy wagon and a driver, a grizzled older man named Walt who had a tobacco-stained beard and kind eyes. He helped load their belongings with care, treating even their battered trunk as though it was valuable. The ride to the ranch took most of the morning, following a rutted road that wound through grassland dotted with cattle and up into the foothills where the air grew cooler and smelled of pine. The ranch came into view around midday, and Josephine felt her breath catch. The main house was a solid log structure, newly built, with glass windows and a wide porch. Beyond it stood a barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse, and a smaller cabin that Fletcher pointed to as theirs. It was more space and more comfort than Josephine had dared to hope for. "It is not fancy," Fletcher said, almost apologetically, "but it is solid and it is warm in winter. I built the cabin myself last fall." "It is perfect," Josephine said, and she meant it. Their cabin had 2 rooms, one for sleeping and one for living, with a small iron stove for cooking and heating. There was a real bed frame with rope supports and a mattress stuffed with fresh straw, plus 2 smaller pallet beds for the younger girls. There was a table, 4 chairs, a shelf for their few books, and pegs on the wall for hanging clothes. To Josephine, who had spent the last week sleeping on a thin mattress on a dirt floor, it was a palace. Fletcher left them to settle in, saying he would send someone to fetch her for supper so she could meet the ranch hands and start learning the routine. Josephine unpacked their belongings, made up the beds, and tried to calm her nerves. This was a fresh start, a chance to build something better for her sisters. She could not afford to fail. That evening, a young cowhand named Thomas knocked on their door and escorted them to the main house. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a cast-iron stove, a deep sink with a hand pump, and shelves stocked with supplies. 6 men sat around a long wooden table, their conversation dying as Josephine and her sisters entered. Fletcher stood and made introductions. Besides Walt, there was Thomas, who was barely 18 and still had a boyish face. There was Miguel, a quiet man in his 30s who had the weathered look of someone who lived outdoors. There were the twin brothers Jack and James, impossible to tell apart, both grinning and friendly. And there was Red, so named for his hair, who served as the ranch foreman and had a commanding presence despite being shorter than the others. "Men, this is Miss Josephine Crawford and her sisters Margaret, Caroline, and Anne," Fletcher said. "They will be living on the ranch now. Miss Crawford will be managing the house and cooking, and her sisters will help with various tasks. I expect you all to treat them with respect." "Welcome, ladies," Red said, and the others echoed him with varying degrees of enthusiasm. That first supper was awkward, with Josephine and her sisters sitting at one end of the table while the men ate the stew that Fletcher had made himself. It was edible but plain, and Josephine could see immediately where she could improve things. After the meal, she shooed everyone out and began cleaning up, with Margaret drying dishes and Caroline putting them away while Anne swept the floor. Fletcher appeared in the kitchen doorway as they were finishing. "You do not have to start tonight. You just arrived." "I might as well learn where everything is," Josephine said. She dried her hands on a towel and turned to face him. "What time do the men eat breakfast?" "Early, around 5:30 before they head out for the day. Then I will be here at 4:30 to have it ready." Fletcher frowned. "That is very early." "I am used to early," Josephine said, "and I am used to hard work. You are giving my sisters and me a home, Mr. Irving. The least I can do is earn it." "Fletcher," he corrected gently. "And you are not a charity case, Miss Crawford. This is a job and I am paying you for it." "Josephine, then," she said, "if we are going to be informal." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of partnership, of mutual respect. Fletcher smiled. "Very well, Josephine, I will see you in the morning." The next weeks settled into a rhythm that was exhausting but sustainable. Josephine woke before dawn to prepare breakfast for hungry cowboys, feeding them eggs and bacon and biscuits and strong coffee. After they left for the day, she cleaned the kitchen and the main house, with Margaret helping with the heavier work. Caroline took charge of the chickens Fletcher kept behind the cabin and started a vegetable garden, her earlier experience proving valuable. Anne, too young for much labor, was given the task of collecting wildflowers for the table and entertaining the men with her chatter during meals. In the afternoons, Josephine tackled whatever needed doing, from laundry to mending to preserving food for the winter. Fletcher had been right about needing help with accounts, and she spent her evenings by lamplight, recording expenses and income in a leather-bound ledger, her neat handwriting filling the pages. Fletcher was often gone during the day, working alongside his men to build fences, move cattle, and repair equipment. But he always returned for supper, and Josephine found herself looking forward to those evening meals. The men would tell stories of the day's adventures, and Fletcher would discuss ranch business with Red. And slowly, the household began to feel less like a collection of strangers and more like something resembling a family. It was during one of those suppers, about a month after they had arrived, that Caroline asked the question that had been on Josephine's mind. "Fletcher, why did you start a ranch? Did you grow up on one?" Fletcher leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "No, I grew up in Kansas City. My father was a banker, and he expected me to follow in his footsteps. But I never liked being cooped up indoors, and I hated the politics of city life. When I turned 21, I took my inheritance and headed west. I worked on ranches in Texas and Wyoming, learning the trade. About 2 years ago, I decided it was time to build something of my own." "Do you ever miss your family?" Anne asked, her voice small. "Sometimes," Fletcher admitted. "But my father and I did not see eye to eye on most things. He thought I was throwing my life away. Maybe I am, but I would rather fail at something I love than succeed at something I hate." Josephine understood that sentiment completely. She had felt trapped by her circumstances in Manassa, bound by obligation and lack of opportunity. Here, the work was still hard, but it felt purposeful. She was building something too, even if it was just a stable life for her sisters. As summer deepened, Josephine noticed small things about Fletcher that made her heart do strange things. The way he always thanked her for the meals, even though it was her job to cook them. The way he brought Anne a carved wooden horse one day, saying he had made it in the evenings when he could not sleep. The way he insisted that Margaret take books from his personal collection and improve her rating. The way he taught Caroline to ride one of the gentler horses, patient with her initial fear and delighted by her eventual joy. But most of all, she noticed the way he looked at her. It was not the leering gaze she had endured from some of the men in town, or the dismissive glances that told her she was beneath notice. Fletcher looked at her as though she was interesting, as though her thoughts and opinions mattered. He asked her advice on household purchases, and listened when she suggested improvements to the kitchen layout. He inquired about her day not out of politeness but genuine interest. Josephine tried to keep her feelings in check. Fletcher was her employer, and she was dependent on him for her and her sister's survival. The last thing she needed was to complicate that relationship with messy emotions. But her heart had other ideas, and she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, remembering the sound of his laugh or the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It was Red who first noticed the way things were developing. He cornered Josephine one afternoon in the kitchen while she was making bread, his expression serious. "I have known Fletcher for 3 years now," he said without preamble. "Worked with him in Wyoming before we came here. He is a good man, Miss Josephine, one of the best I have known." "I know that," Josephine said carefully, wondering where this was going. "He is also terrible at talking about his feelings," Red continued. "He will work himself half to death and never complain. He will help anyone who needs it and never ask for anything back. But when it comes to matters of the heart, he is a damn fool." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "I am sure I do not know what you mean." Red laughed, a short bark of amusement. "Sure you do not. Look, I am just saying that if you wait for him to say something, you might be waiting a long time. He is terrified of making you uncomfortable since you work for him. He thinks you will feel obligated to return his feelings or some noble nonsense like that." "He has feelings?" Josephine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lord, woman, he looks at you like you hung the moon and stars," Red said. "Every single one of us has noticed. Thomas even asked him about it, and Fletcher nearly fell off his horse from embarrassment. Josephine turned back to her bread dough, kneading it with more force than necessary. Even if that were true, what am I supposed to do about it? Throw myself at my employer? I have my sisters to think about. I am not telling you to do anything, Red said. Just wanted you to know where things stand. Fletcher would never take advantage of his position, which means if something is going to happen, you might need to make the first move, or at least let him know you would be receptive. That is all I am saying. He left her alone with her thoughts and her bread. Josephine shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise, her mind whirling. Was Red right? Did Fletcher have feelings for her? And if he did, what was she supposed to do about it? The answer came to her that evening during supper. Fletcher had been out all day marking cattle, and he was tired and dusty and quiet. As the men ate, Josephine watched him from across the table, noting the exhaustion in his eyes and the slump of his shoulders. When the meal was done and the men had retreated to the bunkhouse, Fletcher remained, helping clear the table even though she told him it was not necessary. "You work too hard," Josephine said as she washed dishes and he dried. "Look who is talking," Fletcher replied with a tired smile. "You have been up since before dawn, but I am getting paid to do this," she pointed out. "You are the owner. You are supposed to delegate." "I do not like asking people to do what I would not do myself," Fletcher said. He set down a dried plate and turned to face her. "Josephine, I have been meaning to talk to you about wages. I think I am not paying you enough for all that you do." "You are paying me fairly," Josephine protested. "You are cooking 3 meals a day for 7 people, maintaining the house, managing the books, and still finding time to help your sisters with their education. That is the work of 3 people, and I am paying you for 1. You are also housing and feeding all 4 of us," Josephine reminded him. "That has value beyond money." Fletcher ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had learned meant he was frustrated. "I just want to make sure you are happy here, that you do not feel taken advantage of." "I am happy," Josephine said and realized it was true. Despite the hard work, despite the long hours, she was happier than she had been in years. "You have given my sisters stability and hope. You have treated us with nothing but kindness and respect. I could not ask for more." "You could," Fletcher said quietly. "You should. You deserve more than just stability and kindness." There was something in his voice that made Josephine's pulse quicken. She set down the dish she was washing and turned to face him fully. "What do I deserve, Fletcher?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out in his eyes. Then he took a step back, breaking whatever spell had been building between them. "You deserve to not have your employer making you uncomfortable. I apologize. It has been a long day." "Fletcher," Josephine said, but he was already heading for the door. "Good night, Josephine. Thank you for another excellent meal." She watched him go, frustration warring with something else, something warmer and more dangerous. Red had been right. Fletcher was going to be noble about this until the end of time unless she did something. The question was, did she have the courage? The opportunity came a week later. Fletcher announced at breakfast that he needed to ride into Denver to meet with a cattle buyer, and he would be gone for 3 days. Red would be in charge of the ranch in his absence, and he trusted everything would run smoothly. "I will bring back supplies," Fletcher said. "If anyone needs anything, let me know." "Books," Margaret said immediately. "We have read all the ones you have 4 times. Peppermint sticks," Anne added hopefully. "A new dress for Josephine," Caroline said. "She only has the 2 and they are both wearing thin." Josephine felt her face heat. "I do not need a new dress." "You do," Fletcher said firmly. "Consider it a work expense. I cannot have my house manager looking shabby. Write down your measurements and I will see what I can find." He left the next morning before dawn, and the ranch felt oddly empty without him. Josephine found herself looking up from her tasks, expecting to see him and finding only his absence. It was ridiculous how much she missed him after only a few hours. The days passed slowly. The men were quieter at meals without Fletcher's easy conversation to guide things. Even Anne seemed subdued, asking twice when Fletcher would return. Josephine kept busy, using the time to deep clean parts of the house that usually got overlooked and to work ahead on mending. On the third evening, just as the sun was setting, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Anne shrieked with joy and ran outside, followed more sedately by her sisters. Fletcher pulled up in front of the main house, looking travel-worn but pleased. "I come bearing treasures," he announced, climbing down from the wagon. He handed Anne a paper bag full of peppermint sticks, which made her dance with delight. For Margaret, he had a stack of 5 new books, including a volume of Shakespeare that made the girl gasp with excitement. For Caroline, he had a beautiful leather journal and a set of drawing pencils, saying he had noticed her interest in sketching. "And for you," he said to Josephine, pulling out a wrapped package. "I hope the size is right." Josephine unwrapped the package with trembling fingers. Inside was not one dress but 2, both in sturdy cotton that would wear well. One was a deep blue that reminded her of evening sky, and the other was a green the color of new leaves. They were simple but well made, and more expensive than anything she had owned in years. "Fletcher, this is too much," she whispered. "It is what you deserve," he said. "Try them on and let me know if they need adjusting. I kept the receipt just in case." That night, after her sisters were asleep, Josephine tried on both dresses by lamplight. They fit perfectly, hugging her figure in a way that her old dresses, worn and faded, never had. She caught sight of herself in the small mirror Fletcher had provided for the cabin and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked young again, and pretty, and hopeful. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Josephine grabbed a shawl to wrap around the dress and opened the door to find Fletcher standing there, still in his traveling clothes, holding a small wooden box. "I am sorry to disturb you so late," he said, "but I realized I forgot to give you this. It is not much, just something I saw and thought of you." He handed her the box and turned to leave, but Josephine caught his arm. "Wait, please, come in for a moment." Fletcher hesitated, clearly aware of the impropriety, but Josephine was done with propriety. She was done with dancing around what both of them felt. She pulled him gently inside and closed the door. "Josephine," Fletcher said, his voice rough, "I should not be here." "Why did you really hire me?" she asked, setting the box aside unopened. "You could have hired anyone. An older woman, someone with experience." "Why us?" Fletcher was silent for a long moment. "Because I saw you at the church that day, scrubbing floors on your hands and knees while your sisters tried to help, and I saw someone who would do anything to protect the people she loved. I saw strength and determination and grace under circumstances that would have broken most people, and I wanted to help. That is all it was at first, I swear to you, just a desire to help." "And now," Josephine pressed, "what is it now?" "Now it is torture," Fletcher said, and there was anguish in his voice. "Because you are here every day, and you are brilliant and beautiful and kind, and I cannot say anything or do anything because you work for me, because you depend on me. I will not be the kind of man who uses that power, Josephine. I will not." "What if I am using my power?" Josephine asked. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes. "What if I am telling you, as a woman with full agency and choice, that I have feelings for you, that I think about you constantly, that when you are gone, the whole ranch feels empty?" Fletcher stared at her as though she had spoken a foreign language. "You have feelings for me." "Yes, you stubborn man," Josephine said, and she could not help but laugh. "I have had feelings for you since that day in the church when you spoke kindly to Anne. They have only grown stronger every day since. I tried to ignore them. I tried to be professional. But Red said you were too noble to say anything, and he was right." "Red needs to mind his own business," Fletcher muttered, but his hands came up to cradle Josephine's face with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Are you sure? Because once I kiss you, there is no going back. I am falling in love with you, Josephine Crawford, and if you let me, I will love you for the rest of my life." "Then kiss me," Josephine whispered, "and let us both fall together." Fletcher kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. His lips were soft against hers, asking rather than demanding, offering rather than taking. Josephine kissed him back, pouring months of longing and hope into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you properly. Ask for your hand like a gentleman." "You are the only gentleman I know who works from dawn to dusk mucking out stalls and mending fences," Josephine teased. "You know what I mean," Fletcher said. He kissed her again, quick and sweet. "I should go before I forget all my good intentions. But tomorrow we will talk properly, about us, about the future." He left, and Josephine sank onto her bed, her heart racing. She picked up the small wooden box he had brought and opened it. Inside, nestled in a scrap of velvet, was a delicate silver locket on a chain. She opened the locket and found it empty, waiting for photographs or locks of hair or whatever treasures she wanted to keep close to her heart. She fell asleep with the locket clutched in her hand and a smile on her face. The next morning, Fletcher asked Red to take over breakfast duties, claiming he needed to discuss important business with Josephine. This caused much speculation among the ranch hands, especially when Fletcher led Josephine away from the house and toward a small rise that overlooked the ranch and the mountains beyond. They sat on a flat rock warmed by the early sun, and Fletcher took her hand in his. "I have been thinking all night," he said, "about how to make this work, about how to be fair to you and your sisters." "Fletcher, I do not need grand gestures," Josephine interrupted. "I just need honesty." "Then here is my honesty," Fletcher said. "I am in love with you. I want you to be my wife, not my employee. I want to build this ranch with you as my partner, not just my house manager. I want to raise your sisters as if they were my own. But I also know that we have only known each other a few months, and you might want time to be sure of your feelings." "I am sure," Josephine said. "But you are right that it is fast. What will people say?" "I do not much care what people say," Fletcher replied, "but I want you to be comfortable. Here is what I propose. We court for the next few months, properly, openly. I will speak to Preacher Davidson and make my intentions clear. If by the end of the summer you still want to marry me, we will wed. And if you change your mind, you will keep your job and your home, no questions asked. I want you to feel free to choose without fear of consequences." Josephine thought about it, turning the proposal over in her mind. It was sensible and considerate, exactly what she would expect from Fletcher. "And my sisters, how do they figure into this?" "They are part of you," Fletcher said simply. "If you marry me, they become my family too. I will provide for them, educate them, and help them find their way in the world. Margaret is bright enough to become a teacher if she wants. Caroline has an artist's eye. Anne is still young, but she will find her passion. I want to give them opportunities they would not have otherwise." Tears stung Josephine's eyes. "You really mean all of that?" "Every word," Fletcher said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "So, Miss Crawford, will you allow me to court you?" "Yes," Josephine said. "Yes, I will." News of their courtship spread through the ranch by midday, thanks to Anne's inability to keep secrets. The little girl had seen Fletcher kiss Josephine on the cheek before breakfast and had immediately announced to everyone in hearing distance that her sister was going to marry the rancher. Margaret and Caroline were thrilled, bombarding Josephine with questions she could barely answer. The ranch hands ranged from amused to delighted, with Red looking particularly smug. That Sunday, Fletcher rode into Manassa with Josephine and her sisters in the wagon. He spoke privately with Preacher Davidson before the service, and by the time it ended, the whole town knew that Fletcher Irving was courting Josephine Crawford with intent to marry. Mrs. Henderson hugged Josephine tight and told her she deserved every happiness. Even Mr. Patterson at the general store managed to smile and wished her well. Ruby, when Josephine made a point to visit her at the saloon, laughed until tears ran down her face. "I knew it," she crowed. "I told you that man was decent, did I not? And here you are about to become a rancher's wife." "Good for you, honey. You have earned it." The summer that followed was one of the happiest of Josephine's life. Fletcher courted her with steady determination, bringing her wildflowers he picked himself and taking her on evening walks around the ranch. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams. Fletcher told her about his lonely childhood as an only child in a house full of expectations. Josephine told him about her mother's death and her father's quiet grief and the fear that had consumed her after she became responsible for her sisters. "You are the strongest person I know," Fletcher said one evening as they watched the sunset from the porch of the main house. "You carried so much and you never broke." "I almost did," Josephine admitted. "There were nights I cried myself to sleep wondering how I would make it through the next day." "But you did make it through," Fletcher said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his warmth. "And now you do not have to do it alone anymore." Fletcher included Josephine in all decisions about the ranch, asking her opinion on everything from which cattle to breed to where to build the next fence line. She proved to have a good head for business, catching accounting errors the previous bookkeeper had missed and suggesting more efficient ways to organize supplies. Red joked that Fletcher should make her a full partner, and Fletcher agreed, drawing up papers that gave Josephine a stake in the ranch regardless of whether they married. "This is yours," he said when he showed her the documents. "Not as my potential wife, but as compensation for the work you have done. You have made this ranch run smoother than it ever did before. That is worth recognizing." Josephine was overwhelmed by the gesture. She now owned 10% of the ranch outright, which meant she had security independent of Fletcher. It was the ultimate proof of his respect for her, and it made her love him even more. As for her sisters, they blossomed under the stability and attention. Margaret devoured the books Fletcher provided and began teaching Anne to read more advanced texts. She also started helping Josephine with the account books, showing an aptitude for numbers that surprised everyone. Caroline's drawings improved dramatically, and Fletcher framed several of her best pieces to hang in the main house. Anne remained the social butterfly, charming everyone from the ranch hands to the visiting cattle buyers. One warm August evening, Fletcher asked Josephine to take a ride with him. They saddled horses and rode out to a meadow a few miles from the ranch, where a small creek bubbled over smooth stones and the grass grew tall and green. Fletcher spread a blanket and unpacked a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and cold chicken. "I used to come here when I first bought the land," Fletcher said as they ate. "Before I started building, I would sit here and imagine what the ranch could become. I saw the house and the barns and the cattle, but I never imagined having someone to share it with. I thought I would build this place and live here alone until I died." "That is a sad vision," Josephine said. "I was a sad man," Fletcher admitted. I did not think I was capable of the kind of love I saw in other people. My parents did not have a happy marriage, and I thought maybe I was not built for that kind of connection. But then I met you, and everything changed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Josephine's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a gold ring with a small but beautiful diamond. "Josephine Crawford," Fletcher said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I know we said we would wait until the end of summer, but I cannot wait any longer. I am sure of my feelings, and I hope you are sure of yours. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the love of my life?" "Yes," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." Fletcher slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was kissing her with a passion that made her forget everything except the feel of his lips and the strength of his arms around her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher laughed with pure joy. "I love you," he said. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Josephine replied. "I think I have since that first day at the church, even though I did not realize it then." They returned to the ranch as the stars were coming out, hand in hand, both glowing with happiness. Anne spotted the ring immediately and shrieked with excitement, waking the entire household. The ranch hands came out of the bunkhouse to see what the commotion was, and when they learned of the engagement, they insisted on celebrating. Miguel produced a guitar and played while Thomas and the twins danced with Margaret and Caroline. Red broke out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and toasts were made to the happy couple. Preacher Davidson agreed to marry them at the end of September, giving them time to prepare for a small but meaningful ceremony. Josephine worked with Mrs. Henderson to alter a dress that had belonged to the boarding house owner's daughter, transforming it into a beautiful wedding gown. Fletcher arranged for a photographer to come from Denver, wanting to capture the day for posterity. The ranch hands built a wooden arch and decorated it with late-season wildflowers, creating an altar in front of the main house. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the aspens in the mountains turning gold and the air carrying the first hint of autumn chill. Josephine dressed with her sister's help, her hands shaking so badly that Margaret had to fasten the buttons. The dress was ivory silk with lace at the collar and sleeves, and the locket Fletcher had given her hung around her neck. "You look like a princess," Anne breathed, her eyes wide. "She looks like herself," Caroline corrected. "Just happier." Margaret hugged Josephine tight. "I am so glad you found him. You deserve this." They walked together to where the ceremony would take place. Fletcher waited at the altar, dressed in a new suit that made him look handsome and sophisticated and completely unlike his usual dusty self. But when he saw Josephine walking toward him, his face broke into a smile of such genuine joy that she knew she would remember it forever. Preacher Davidson performed the ceremony, his words simple but heartfelt. Fletcher and Josephine exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to love and support each other through whatever life brought. When Fletcher slipped the wedding band onto Josephine's finger, his hand was steady, but she could see tears in his eyes. "You may kiss your bride," Preacher Davidson said, and Fletcher did, thoroughly and tenderly, to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered. The celebration that followed was joyous and relaxed. A long table had been set up outdoors, and everyone contributed to the feast. There was roasted beef and fresh bread, vegetables from Caroline's garden, and pies made from wild berries. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was music and dancing as the sun set. Fletcher danced with Josephine first, then with each of her sisters in turn, making them all feel special and loved. As the evening wore on and the stars came out, Josephine found herself standing a little apart from the celebration, watching her sisters laugh with the ranch hands and her husband, that wonderful word, chat with the preacher. She felt a presence beside her and turned to find Red. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I ever thought possible," Josephine admitted. "Good," Red said. "You both deserve it. Fletcher is a different man since you came here, more alive, more human. You have been good for him." "He has been good for me too," Josephine said. "He gave me back my life." "No," Red said thoughtfully. "He just helped you build a new one. You did the hard part yourself." That night, after the guests had departed and her sisters were settled in the cabin with strict instructions to stay there, Josephine and Fletcher finally had time alone. He carried her over the threshold of the main house, which would now be their home, and set her down gently in the bedroom he had prepared. "Are you nervous?" Fletcher asked, his hands gentle on her waist. "A little," Josephine admitted. "But mostly I am happy. I never thought I would have this. A husband who loves me, a home that is truly mine, a future that is not just survival." "You will always have those things," Fletcher promised. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you feel loved and safe and cherished." He kissed her then, and they lost themselves in each other, creating the foundation of their new life together. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. A harsh winter tested the ranch's resources, and they lost several cattle to cold and disease. Fletcher worked himself to exhaustion trying to protect the herd, and Josephine stayed up late many nights keeping watch on sick animals. But they faced it together, and the ranch survived. Margaret continued her education, and at 16 expressed interest in attending a teaching college. Fletcher wrote letters and made arrangements, ensuring she would have the opportunity when she was ready. Caroline, now 14, asked for more art supplies and began selling small drawings to people in town. Anne, at 10, had become the ranch's unofficial ambassador, greeting every visitor with enthusiasm and charm. In the spring of 1884, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mix of joy and fear. She had spent so much time caring for others that the thought of having her own child was overwhelming. But Fletcher was thrilled, treating her like she was made of glass and insisting she cut back on heavy work. "I can still cook breakfast," Josephine protested when he tried to take over. "You can supervise breakfast," Fletcher countered. "Margaret and Caroline can do the actual cooking. You need to rest." "I am pregnant, not dying," Josephine said, but she was touched by his concern. The ranch rallied around her. The men were careful not to create extra work and often brought her small gifts, wildflowers or interesting rocks, or once, memorably, a baby rabbit that Thomas had rescued from a hawk. Her sisters hovered, excited about becoming aunts. Fletcher read to her every evening from a medical book he had purchased, learning everything he could about pregnancy and childbirth. "It says here that you should avoid stress," he read one night. "Then stop reading that book," Josephine teased. "It is making us both stressed." Their son was born in early December, a difficult labor that left Josephine exhausted but triumphant. Fletcher held the baby with a wonder that brought tears to Josephine's eyes, this big, strong man reduced to awed silence by the tiny life in his arms. "What should we name him?" Fletcher asked. "Samuel," Josephine said immediately, "after my father, if that is all right with you." "Samuel Irving," Fletcher said, testing the name. "I think it is perfect." Little Samuel was a good baby, healthy and alert. Anne immediately declared him the most beautiful baby ever born, while Caroline started sketching him constantly, creating a record of his early days. Margaret helped with nighttime feedings, freeing Josephine to rest and recover. Fletcher proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with Samuel when he fussed. He built a beautiful wooden cradle and carved toys, determined that his son would have everything he needed. But more than material things, Fletcher gave Samuel time and attention, talking to him constantly and singing him lullabies in a surprisingly good voice. Over the next few years, the ranch prospered. Word spread about the quality of Fletcher's cattle, and he began to get orders from as far away as Texas. He hired additional help, bringing the total ranch hands to 10, and built a second bunkhouse to accommodate them. The house was expanded too, adding more bedrooms for their growing family. Margaret left for teaching college in 1886, though she returned each summer to help on the ranch. She wrote letters describing her studies and her growing confidence, and Josephine took pride in watching her sister become an educated, independent woman. Caroline continued her art and began taking commissions for portraits, her skill improving with each piece. At 16, she was becoming a talented artist with a growing reputation. Anne, now 12, had developed a passion for horses and spent most of her time in the stables. Fletcher taught her to train young horses, and she proved to have a natural gift for it. She was fearless and intuitive, able to calm even the most skittish animal. In 1887, Josephine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Ruth. She had Fletcher's gray-blue eyes and Josephine's dark hair, and she ruled the household with an iron fist from the moment she could express her preferences. Samuel, now 3, was initially skeptical of this noisy newcomer but gradually warmed to her, especially when he realized she would laugh at his antics. Fletcher continued to be an excellent husband and father, always making time for his family despite the demands of the ranch. He taught Samuel to ride and Ruth to recognize different birds. He celebrated Caroline's art shows in town and corresponded faithfully with Margaret at school. He gave Anne increasing responsibility with the horses, recognizing her talent and nurturing it. For Josephine, life had become everything she never knew she wanted. She managed the household and helped with the ranch accounts, but more than that, she was happy. She had a husband who loved her deeply, children who were healthy and thriving, and sisters who had grown into remarkable young women. The fear and exhaustion of those early days in Manassa seemed like a distant dream. One evening in the fall of 1888, Josephine stood on the porch of their home watching Fletcher play with Samuel and Ruth in the yard. The sun was setting, painting everything gold, and she could hear Caroline and Anne laughing in the barn. Margaret's latest letter sat in her pocket, full of news about her teaching position at a school back east. Fletcher caught her eye and smiled, that same smile that had made her heart flutter years ago. He jogged over, leaving the children chasing each other in circles, and pulled her into his arms. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, kissing her forehead. "I am thinking about how far we have come," Josephine said. "Do you remember when I was working 3 jobs just to feed my sisters, when I thought that was all my life would ever be? I remember a woman who was the strongest, bravest person I had ever met," Fletcher said, "who took care of her family against impossible odds. And then a cowboy married me and hired them all," Josephine said with a laugh. "Put us all to work on his ranch. Best decision I ever made," Fletcher said. "Though I seem to recall you doing a fair amount of work convincing me to propose." "You needed convincing," Josephine teased. "You were being too noble." "Well, my nobility only lasted so long around you," Fletcher said. He grew serious, his hands tightening around her waist. "I love you, Josephine, more now than the day we married. You have given me a family, a real home. You have made everything I built here actually mean something." "I love you too," Josephine said. "Thank you for saving us, for giving my sisters opportunities they never would have had, for being the man I needed." "Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense," Fletcher replied. Samuel ran up to them then, demanding his father's attention for some urgent 6-year-old business. Ruth toddled after him, not wanting to be left out. Fletcher scooped them both up, one in each arm, making them squeal with laughter. Josephine watched her family, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Josephine sat down to write a letter to Margaret. She told her about the day's events, about Samuel's antics and Ruth's new words, and the order Fletcher had received for 50 head of cattle. But mostly, she wrote about gratitude. "I used to think happiness was having enough to eat and a roof over our heads," she wrote. "I used to think that survival was the best I could hope for, but I was wrong. Happiness is this, all of this. A family that loves each other, work that matters, a future full of possibilities. I am so grateful that you and Caroline and Anne get to see what life can be when you have support and opportunity. I hope you will take these lessons and build your own happiness, whatever form that takes." She sealed the letter and left it for the morning post. Fletcher found her still sitting at the desk, staring into the darkness beyond the window. "Come to bed," he said softly. "The ranch will still be here tomorrow." "I know," Josephine said. "I was just thinking about all the tomorrows we have ahead of us." "It is overwhelming in the best possible way. One day at a time," Fletcher said, taking her hand. "That is all we need to do, one day at a time together." They walked to their bedroom hand in hand, and Josephine thought about how far they had both come. Fletcher had found the family he never knew he needed. She had found security, love, and a partnership that made everything else possible. Her sisters had found opportunities and support. The ranch had become not just a business but a home for everyone who lived there. As she drifted off to sleep in Fletcher's arms, Josephine thought about that desperate young woman scrubbing church floors, trying so hard to keep her family together. She wished she could go back and tell her that everything would be all right, that a kind cowboy would change everything. That love and hard work could build something beautiful, but maybe that woman had known all along. Maybe she had just been waiting for the right partner to help carry the load. The years continued to pass with the same mix of challenges and joys that mark any well-lived life. In 1890, Margaret returned from college with a degree, and a young man named Robert, also a teacher, whom she had met during her studies. Fletcher gave them his blessing and a substantial wedding gift, and they married that summer in the same spot where Josephine and Fletcher had exchanged their vows. Robert was a good man, patient and kind, and he fit easily into the ranch family. They settled in Denver where they both taught but visited often. Caroline's art continued to gain recognition, and in 1892, at age 20, she held her first real exhibition in Denver. Fletcher and Josephine took the whole family to see it, and they stood proudly as Caroline's paintings sold one after another. A gallery owner offered to represent her, and suddenly, Caroline had a career that could support her independently. She chose to split her time between Denver and the ranch, needing the solitude and inspiration of ranch life for her art. Anne, who had never lost her love of horses, became Fletcher's right hand in all matters equine. At 18, she was training horses for clients across Colorado, with a reputation for being able to work with even the most difficult animals. Fletcher built her a dedicated training facility on ranch land, and she ran it with the same determination Josephine had once shown working 3 jobs. Samuel grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved the ranch life. He followed Fletcher everywhere, learning to rope and ride and manage cattle. He had his father's steady temperament and his mother's quick mind, and Fletcher often said he would be running the ranch one day. Ruth, as she grew, showed an interest in the business side of ranching, often sitting with Josephine to learn the books. She was sharp with numbers and had a head for strategy that surprised everyone. In 1893, Josephine gave birth to their third child, another son they named James. He was a happy baby who rarely cried and seemed content to watch the world from whichever family member was holding him. Samuel and Ruth doted on him, fighting over who got to help with his care. Fletcher joked that James would be spoiled rotten with all the attention, but his eyes were soft with love whenever he held his youngest son. The ranch continued to expand. Fletcher purchased adjacent land, doubling their acreage, and experimented with new cattle breeds. He became known throughout Colorado as a fair employer and a smart rancher, and young men came from miles around hoping to work for him. Red remained foreman, older now but still sharp and effective. Many of the original ranch hands had moved on to start their own spreads, but they stayed in touch, creating a network of former Irving ranch workers across the West. Through it all, Josephine and Fletcher's love only deepened. They had learned each other's rhythms and moods, knew how to support and challenge each other. They still took evening walks when time allowed, talking about everything from the children's education to politics to their dreams for the future. They had disagreements, of course, but they had learned to argue fairly and forgive quickly. On their 10th anniversary in 1893, Fletcher surprised Josephine with a trip to Denver, just the two of them. It was the first time they had been away from the children overnight, and Josephine felt strangely young again, walking through city streets with her husband, dining in restaurants, and attending a theater performance. They stayed in a nice hotel, and Fletcher gave her a gift, a beautiful oil painting that Caroline had made of the ranch, showing the main house, the mountains beyond, and tiny figures that were their family. "So you never forget where we started," Fletcher said, "and how far we have come." "I could never forget," Josephine said, tears in her eyes. "You gave me everything, Fletcher." "No," he said firmly. "We built this together. I gave you opportunity, maybe, and a place to build. But you did the building. You made this house a home. You raised your sisters and our children. You turned a business into a family. That was all you." "It was us," Josephine insisted. "It has always been us." They made love that night with the same passion they had shared as newlyweds, and Josephine marveled at how physical desire could coexist with such deep emotional connection. This was not just attraction anymore, though she still found Fletcher devastatingly handsome. This was intimacy built on years of trust and partnership, and it was more powerful than anything she had experienced in those early days. When they returned to the ranch, their children mobbed them, even Samuel and Ruth, who were usually too dignified for such displays. James clung to Josephine like she had been gone for years rather than days. Anne wanted to show them a new horse she had started training. Caroline had finished a new painting. The ranch hands had questions about cattle sales and feed orders. Within hours, they were back in the rhythm of ranch life, and Josephine would not have had it any other way. As the 1890s progressed, the ranch became more established and successful. Fletcher was able to hire additional help, taking some of the burden off everyone. He insisted that Josephine hire a girl from town to help with cooking and cleaning, and though she protested at first, she came to appreciate having assistance. It gave her more time with the children, and more time to work on projects she cared about. One of those projects was education. Josephine had never forgotten how her mother's insistence on learning had given her options other women did not have. She worked with the local community to establish a proper school in Manassa, donating money for the building and supplies. When it opened in 1895, Margaret came to teach there for a year, bringing Robert with her. It was a joyful reunion, having Margaret home again, and the school thrived under her guidance. Fletcher's parents, who had disapproved of his Western adventure for so many years, finally visited in 1896. His father was old now, and his mother had softened with age. They spent a month at the ranch, and Josephine watched as Fletcher and his father found a cautious peace. The elder Irving admitted he had been wrong about Fletcher's choice, that his son had built something impressive and lasting. It was not a warm reconciliation, but it was something, and Fletcher seemed lighter after they left. The turn of the century approached, and with it, changes. Samuel, now 16, was already talking about expanding the ranch operations. Ruth, at 13, had started corresponding with cattle buyers, showing a natural talent for negotiation. James, at 7, was the ranch's little shadow, loved by everyone. Margaret had 2 children of her own now, and she brought them to visit each summer. Caroline's art was being shown in galleries across the West. Anne had married one of the ranch hands, a quiet man named Daniel who loved horses as much as she did, and they were expecting their first child. Through all of this, Josephine and Fletcher remained the center, the foundation on which everything else was built. They were in their late 30s now, with gray beginning to show in their hair and lines around their eyes from years of sun and laughter. But they were healthy and happy and still very much in love. One evening in the spring of 1900, Josephine and Fletcher sat on the porch swing he had built, watching yet another sunset paint the sky. Their 3 children were visible in various parts of the ranch, going about their business. The sounds of ranch life, cattle lowing, horses nickering, men calling to each other, formed a familiar symphony. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had not come to the church that day?" Josephine asked. "If we had never met," Fletcher was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think you would have found a way, you always do. Maybe it would have been harder, taken longer, but you would have given your sisters good lives somehow." "Maybe," Josephine said, "but I am glad I did not have to find out. I am glad you came along when you did." "I am glad too," Fletcher said. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing across her knuckles in a gesture that had become habitual over the years. "You know, when I started this ranch, I thought success meant cattle and land and money. I did not understand that the real success would be this. You, our children, the family we have built. That is the legacy that matters. We have been very lucky," Josephine said. "We have been very determined," Fletcher corrected, "and very committed to each other. That counts for more than luck." As the stars began to appear, one by one, Josephine thought about all the things that had brought her to this moment. Her parents' deaths, terrible as they were, had set her on a path that led here. Her struggles had made her strong enough to be Fletcher's partner. Her love for her sisters had taught her about family, preparing her to raise her own children. Every hardship had a purpose, even if she could not see it at the time. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" Fletcher asked. "For seeing me," Josephine said. "When I was at my lowest, when I was just a desperate woman scrubbing floors, you saw me. You saw that I was worth something. That changed everything." "You were always worth everything," Fletcher said. "I just had the good sense to recognize it." They sat together as the night deepened, comfortable in the silence that came from years of companionship. Inside the house, they could hear James practicing his reading aloud, Ruth helping him with difficult words. From the barn came the sound of Samuel talking to the horses as he settled them for the night. These were the sounds of their life, ordinary and precious. In the years that followed, the Irving family continued to grow and prosper. Samuel married a woman from Denver named Elizabeth, and they gave Josephine and Fletcher their first grandchildren, twin boys born in 1903. Ruth attended college to study business, shocking everyone in Manassa but making her parents proud. James showed an interest in medicine, inspired by Doc Morrison, who still practiced in town. Margaret and Robert had 4 children and remained in Denver, both teaching and loving it. Caroline never married but continued her art, creating pieces that captured the spirit of the West and selling them to collectors around the world. Anne and Daniel had 3 children and ran the horse training operation with great success. Fletcher and Josephine grew old together, watching their family expand and their legacy take shape. The ranch passed to Samuel, but all the children remained involved in various ways. Family gatherings were loud, chaotic, joyful affairs with children running everywhere and conversation flowing like wine. In 1920, on a warm summer evening much like the one where they had first confessed their feelings, Fletcher and Josephine celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary. They sat on the same porch where they had spent countless evenings, now surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Fletcher, now in his 60s but still strong and active, raised his glass. "To my wife," he said, "who took a chance on a cowboy with a dream, who worked harder than anyone I have ever known, who raised incredible children and built an incredible life. I love you more today than I did 37 years ago, which I would not have thought possible." "To my husband," Josephine replied, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes, "who saw me when I needed to be seen, who gave my sisters and me not just opportunity but love, who has been my partner in everything. I am so grateful for every day we have had together." Their family cheered and clinked glasses, and then the celebration continued with food and music and laughter. As the evening wore on and the younger children were put to bed, Josephine and Fletcher found a quiet moment alone under the stars. "We did all right, did we not?" Fletcher said, his arm around her shoulders. "We did more than all right," Josephine said. "We built something beautiful." "Yes," Fletcher agreed. "Yes, we did." They stood there together, 2 people who had found each other when they both needed it most, who had built a life and a family from hard work and deep love. The ranch spread around them, testament to their partnership. Their children and grandchildren filled the house with life and noise. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility. Josephine leaned her head on Fletcher's shoulder, comfortable and content. She thought about that young woman of 19, desperate and afraid, working 3 jobs to keep her family together. She wished she could tell her that everything would work out, that a kind cowboy would change her life, that love could build miracles. But maybe that young woman had known all along. Maybe she had just been waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right chance, and when it came, she had been brave enough to take it. "I love you," Josephine whispered. "I love you too," Fletcher replied, "always and forever." And under the vast Colorado sky, with the mountains standing eternal watch, they held each other close, grateful for every moment, every choice, every day that had brought them here. Their story was one of hardship overcome, of love found, of family built through determination and partnership. It was a good story. It was their story, and it had a happy ending after all.